This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us, Mark Ames. I want to continue with this conversation that we've been having about the murder of Walter Scott in South Carolina and white privilege and all the dimensions of this. And one piece of it has to do with, frankly, Rand Paul, who just announced his candidacy for president of the United States yesterday. In 1982, he wrote an editorial for the Baylor University College paper, Rand Paul. He said, every piece of anti-discrimination legislation passed over the past few decades ignores one of the basic inalienable rights of man, the right to discriminate. He later wrote, this was in 2002, decisions concerning private property and associations should in a free society be unhindered. Some of these associations will discriminate. A free society will abide unofficial private discrimination, even when that means allowing hate-filled groups to exclude people based on the color of their skin. End of quote. This is supposed to be libertarianism. What the hell is libertarianism? Mark Ames, senior editor of Pando Daily, author of Going Postal, Rage, Murder, and Rebellion, From Reagan's Workplaces to Clinton's Columbine and Beyond, is on the line with us. Pando.com, of course, the website. Mark, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for joining us. You wrote a piece for Alternet back in 2013 titled A True History of Libertarianism in America, a Phony Ideology to Promote a Corporate Agenda. Tell us the story. Where did this libertarian thing come from?
Yeah, so, I mean, I find it interesting that, first of all, that people, on the one hand, will say libertarianism is something that's so fresh and new, and it's the big alternative to the two-party stranglehold and so on, without even actually asking or answering, well, where does libertarianism come from? When did it start? Who launched it? Has it always been there? And libertarians themselves have answers for this. If you read their books, it's not particularly fun reading, but I've done a lot of research on this over the years. And they'll all tell you that the modern libertarian movement, and the first people to sort of use that term for this ideology, was launched in 1946, 47. It was a foundation called the Foundation for Economic Education. It's a think tank or whatever you call it, essentially like a 501c3. And it turns out, and the head of it is this guy, Leonard Reed, and he's considered by libertarians sort of the first guru of libertarianism. Well, this is a guy who was a Chamber of Commerce executive, National Association of Manufacturers. Like, he's just a lobbyist. Mm-hmm. He didn't even write his own books, right? And so he sets up this outfit called the FEE right after the war, backed by all the big names in corporate America, the big three auto manufacturers, the big oil companies, banks, the big steel manufacturers, DuPont, Monsanto. And the job of libertarianism in those years, early on, was to provide essentially quasi-intellectual propaganda to back big businesses' push against the New Deal. And so the ideology was basically founded to push back against the New Deal and against social democracy. And these people are hardcore reactionaries, just like Charles Koch. These are real hardcore reactionaries who wanted to take the country back to the days of Harding and Coolidge, with all that implies.
Well, and I was just thinking of Warren Harding. I mean, when he was elected in the election of 1920 on a campaign platform of less business and government, more government, less government in business, more business in government. In other words, deregulate and privatize. And on the campaign platform of dropping the top tax rate on billionaires or rich people back then from 91% down to 25%, both of which he did in 1921 when he became president. What was that called back then? They didn't call it libertarianism. Was that just
Americanism?
It was called what?
Americanism. Also anti-labor. This is a huge part of it too. I mean, it's an anti-labor, anti-social democracy, anti-socialist philosophy and pro-big business. It was essentially called Americanism. America first, isolationism, very violently anti-union, stoking ethnic, and race division, to advance the agenda. I mean, Harding, there were reports that he was inducted into the KKK in the White House. And I'll remind you that Charles Koch, in one of his newsletters right around the time that Obama was elected, I wrote about this for The Nation. Charles Koch did a column in his Koch Industries newspaper and said, people ask me, who do I think is the best president of the 20th century and the worst? And he said, my answer will probably surprise you. Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge were the best presidents that promoted liberty more than anyone. And that's, so the libertarianism, there's the propaganda PR version of what libertarianism means, and because originally they stole that word from the left. Originally, libertarianism has to do with kind of social anarchism from Europe. They kind of stole that word because it had liberty in its root.
So hang on just a second. There's echoes here of other events. I remember in the mid 1970s, in the late 60s and the early 70s, I had been friendly with folks in and supportive of the Right to Life movement, because the Right to Life movement in the late 60s and early 70s was the anti-death penalty movement. They called themselves the Right to Life movement. And after Roe v. Wade, the anti-abortion people took that term, and for a couple of years there were a lot of anti-death penalty people really upset, but they lost the argument. Are you saying that the word libertarian similarly had a completely different meaning and was in use by?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was known as a left-wing socialist, as a part of socialism, essentially European socialism.
Wow.
Chomsky's, you can find this online. Chomsky himself has talked about this. As he said, everywhere else in the world, the term libertarianism is connected to socialism, anarchism from the late 19th century in Europe. And as he said, American libertarianism is essentially from Mars. It's the complete opposite.
Well, it's not from Mars. It's from a lobbyist in 1946.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where it comes from. And I do think it's important to understand the origins of libertarianism, because people seem to keep getting blindsided by what they think are contradictions. For example, you were just talking about Rand Paul, who's actually stating a very basic libertarian belief, which is that people should be able to do whatever they want on their property. That's what they mean by liberty and libertarianism.
Right.
And that means the right to discriminate against anybody of any race, because property is inviolable. It's people who have property should be able to do whatever they want with it, and the more property they have, the more power they should have.
Well, and the Supreme Court took this position for well over 100 years, that the right to associate in the First Amendment had a parallel right, which is the right not to associate, which was the right to discriminate. I mean, they use this to support white-only country clubs and all kinds of stuff. I mean, this is the basis of Plessy v. Ferguson, was it not?
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And on top of it, the idea, he's got a completely false sense of history, though, because on the other hand, the term discrimination also has to do with, with monopoly power, and the populists fought against the discrimination, which was the way that private companies were discriminating against certain farmers in certain regions and so on in order to basically extract profits. And this is deemed illegal by by government, and they've been fighting against price discrimination. So I mean, the idea that there's one definition of discrimination and it's inviolable through history, it's just absurd. And so I think to really understand libertarianism, it's essentially it's a politics and a philosophy for oligarchs, for the super rich, in which property is liberty.
Right, and that reinforces and holds together the essentially white business power structure in this country.
Yes.
Yeah. Mark Ames, you are brilliant. Senior editor of Pando Daily, Pando.com, author of Going Postal. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks again.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.